Hello everyone, and welcome to this video tutorial in which we're going to be doing some contract law revision. And this is a really short tutorial just looking at the rules of consideration. I do have other videos on my channel which go through all of the cases that I'm going to mention here in more detail, but this is just a revision tutorial, so I just wanted to summarise quite briefly, quite concisely, what the rules of consideration are and what the key cases are that you need to remember. So let's just start with a quick reminder about what consideration is. And in contract law, consideration is concerned with the bargain of the contract. And a contract is based on an exchange of promises. And to be enforceable and not what we call a bare promise, there must be consideration. And each party to the contract must receive a benefit and suffer a detriment. And this benefit or detriment is known as consideration. So the first rule that we need to look at is that consideration must be sufficient but need not be adequate. So what this means in its simplest possible form is that for a promise to be enforceable, something has to be given in exchange for it. But that thing that is given has to be something sufficient, but it doesn't need to be the full value, if you like, of the thing that's being given. It doesn't have to be adequate. So to give you an example here, let's say I promise to give you one of my pedigree kittens. Now, if I just say, I'm going to give you a kitten, that's a bare promise. It's unenforceable because you're not giving me anything in exchange. If I promise and say, I'm going to give you this kitten if you give me £10. If you then give me the £10, you've given me consideration, so that would be enforceable. This rule is saying that I can't then turn around and say, oh, actually, my kitten's worth £400 and you only paid me £10. You've not really paid me the market value, so therefore your consideration wasn't enough. The courts aren't considering whether there's going to be a bad bargain, if you like. They're not going to investigate, was the thing given in exchange precisely the correct value that it should have been? Because, of course, that's subjective. So something has to be given, but it doesn't need to be the full market value. So the key case that we've looked at on this is the case of Chappell and Nestle. And if you remember the facts of that case, Nestle ran a sales campaign, a promotion, saying that if you sent in 3 chocolate bar wrappers, you'd be sent a record. And then, of course, they wanted to back out of that particular promise. So they said, well, the wrappers aren't worth anything. You've not given sufficient consideration. But it was held that the wrappers did form part of the consideration, and so the fact that the wrappers were simply going to be thrown away potentially didn't detract from this. So this illustrates the rule that something has to be given, but it doesn't need to be the full market value. And the next rule is that the consideration must move from the promisee. And English contract law has traditionally required that the consideration moves from the promisee, but do remember that the rule has been affected now by the Contracts Rights of Third Parties Act 1999. But this traditional rule that you can see in the case of Tweddle and Atkinson says that a person to whom a promise has been made can only enforce it if they themselves have given consideration for that promise. And this makes a bit more sense when you think about the facts in Tweddle and Atkinson. And in the facts of that case, the partners' fathers each agreed to pay a sum of money to a new husband after a marriage, and they agreed between themselves that the husband would have a right of action to sue should either parent fail to pay. So they clearly intended him to benefit from that promise. However, when the fathers died, it was held that the action must fail because the groom, the person that the promise had been made for, had given no consideration under the agreement. So even though the 2 fathers who made the contract intended the claimant to benefit under the contract, this traditional rule, the consideration must move from the promisee, meant that he was unable to claim. So the third rule of consideration is that existing contractual duty does not constitute consideration. So if a party has an existing duty to do an act, this act cannot then be used as consideration for a new promise. And this is nicely illustrated in the case of Collins and Godefroy. And in this case, Collins had been subpoenaed to attend court and give evidence. And it was in Godefroy's interest that Collins turned up. Godefroy really wanted him in court. So Godefroy said that if Collins attended, this would help his case. So he promised Collins £1 per day for compensation for attending court. After he'd attended court, Collins wanted to be paid his guineas, but Godefroy wasn't paying him, and so the issue for the court was, could Collins enforce Godefroy's promise to give him the guineas? And because of this rule, existing duty does not constitute consideration, the court held that the agreement was not supported by consideration. Collins was under a public duty to attend court anyway because he'd been subpoenaed. And so the law would not allow someone to recover expenses incurred in the performance of a duty that they were obliged to do anyway. So Collins hadn't given any consideration, he was already obliged to attend court. And the fourth rule of consideration is that part payment of a debt is not consideration. So part payment of a debt is not valid consideration for a promise to release the debt in full, and this comes from the ancient case of Pinnell's case from 1602. And this case was confirmed by the House of Lords in Folkes and Beer. And the reasoning really for this rule is that performance of an existing duty is not valid consideration, so part payment of a debt is simply the performance of an existing duty. No practical benefit argument can be used to negate this principle. It doesn't matter if the part payment comes before the due date or some other benefit is conferred. However, there are some exceptions to Pinnell's case, which you will see in my other video tutorial where I go through this area of law in more detail. But for the purposes of our revision, we just need to know that part payment of a debt is not consideration. But do make sure that you're aware of promissory estoppel here, and promissory estoppel was created by Lord Denning in the very famous case of Central London Property Trust and High Trees, and promissory estoppel operates to ensure that a party does not go back on their promise when another party has relied upon that promise. In his judgment, Lord Denning explained that where a promise is made which is intended to be binding, intending to be acted upon, and is also actually acted upon by the other party, it comes binding notwithstanding any limitations of consideration. So this principle of promissory estoppel may be seen to operate as a way in which the requirement of consideration is removed altogether. And so it is a little bit of a controversial rule, but Lord Denning didn't mind being controversial. And the last rule that we're going to look at here, number 5, is that the consideration must not be passed. And this means that a promise to do something now in return for services previously rendered is not going to be binding because there's no consideration. And that's illustrated in the case of Re McArdle. And if you remember the facts of this case, Marjorie McArdle carried out certain improvements and repairs on a bungalow, and after she'd done the work, brothers and sisters signed a document saying that because she'd done all this work, they were going to pay £480 that they'd make from selling the property. They'd pay that sum to her because she'd done the work. But that promise was unenforceable in law because they only made that promise after she'd already done the work. So their consideration, this promise of payment, was passed. So thank you for watching this video tutorial. If you found this revision video helpful at all, I'd really appreciate it if you would like and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already done so, because it really does help me to make new content for you. Thanks for watching.